Suddenly, my light friends told me it was time to return. My first journey was over, and they were asking me to move back into the physical level of reality. I told Bob what was happening, and he instructed me to come back slowly when I was ready. He suggested that I count myself back to my normal state of physical consciousness. As I came out, I again experienced the thick state, like shifting gears back down into low. I counted slowly from 10 to 1. Then my eyes popped open, and I felt wide awake and alert. I don't know how long I lay there thinking about what had happened, as one does with a dream upon awakening. As I moved further away from the experience, it grew less clear in my memory. While I was in the non-physical dimension, the physical one was unclear and hazy. Now that I was back in the physical realm, the non-physical universe was indistinct, part of being back in the thick state of consciousness. It was somewhat like coming out of a dream, except that my non-physical experience had seemed much more real than a dream. After I lay there quietly for a while, Bob asked if I would like to listen to some music while I was coming back into my normal state. I agreed, and he put on a gentle jazz recording that very quickly centered me in my physical body. When I came out of the check unit, I was amazed to see that it was dark outside. I had lost all track of time. It seemed that I had been in this check unit for about 20 minutes. But when I passed the clock in the hallway, I realized I had been in the session for nearly 2 hours. The effect of leaving the physical time-space dimension boggled my mind. Bob was still concentrating on his instruments when I stepped into his control room. I could tell by the energy in the room that he was excited by what had happened. Since he was experiencing my journey as it was taking place, even if second-hand, it was as new and revealing to him as it was to me. He turned to look at me, and his eyes gleamed with excitement. When he asked how I felt, I realized that I was tremendously energized by what had happened. In fact, I felt as if I were floating a few inches off the floor. Another result of our session was that I was extremely hungry. Bob was also hungry, having put as much energy into this session as I had. He suggested that we drive to his favorite restaurant atop Afron Mountain. This would give us a chance not only to satisfy our appetites, but also to talk about what I'd experienced. I was game. David had to teach a college class that evening, and I wasn't expected home for dinner. When the waitress asked for our order, we weren't ready. We had been so busy talking we hadn't looked at the menu. As I began examining the menu, I suddenly became aware of a man standing beside our table. "Fancy meeting you here," the man said as he slid a piece of pie in front of Bob. Bob pulled the pie toward him and picked up his fork as he said, "It's good to have a friend in the kitchen. Rosie, this is George Duretti, my part-time manager at Whistlefield. George, this is Rosie McKnight." George and I nodded to each other as Bob went on to say, after swallowing a bit of pie, that he had been trying to get George to quit his job as kitchen manager at Howard Johnson to work as a full-time manager for him. "But Bob, if I quit my job here, you wouldn't be able to test our specials directly from the kitchen anymore," George said proudly, retying an apron string that was slipping down his waistline. "I can get my favorite pie any time, George, but I can't get my work done at Whistlefield without you," Bob replied with a pleading look. "And by the way, George, Rosie is the latest addition to our Explorer team." George extended his hand and said, "It's a pleasure to meet you, Rosie. Welcome to the team." After George excused himself to get back to work, I looked at Bob and asked what he meant by an Explorer team. "Oh yes," Bob said, "I had forgot to mention that you have just joined a group of elite regulars at our research laboratory. I put a lot of people through the lab, but only certain ones are selected to work with me as explorers." "Wow, Bob," I said, after falling asleep the first time, "I feel lucky that I passed the test my second time in the booth." "You not only passed the test," Bob replied, "you get an A+ for your performance today. You're a natural explorer. I was amazed that you went so deep in only your second session." I didn't expect that. My main goal during today's session was simply to find some electronic frequencies that would at least keep you awake. As it is, I think we have the potential of being long-time explorers together. As Bob talked more about his explorer team, I realized that he was somewhat secretive about his other explorers. He didn't want us to meet each other because he did not want us to compare notes. But he couldn't help telling a little of what was going on with the other explorers. Our visit to Hojo's became a regular event after each explorer session. I learned that there was a husband and wife team, explorer TC and JCA, who came once a week for their sessions. TC was a physicist and seemed to have a very different type of session than his wife, who was a social service executive. TC was unable to report experiences while they happened. He would go through the experience, come back and report it in detail to Bob, and then go back to see what else was happening, or to try to get an answer to one of Bob's questions. His information was much more technical than mine, perhaps because he was a physicist. His wife, JCA, had the ability to report events as they took place, just as I was able to do. One night during our Hojo's outing, Bob began talking excitedly about SHE, she, a female explorer, who worked in a very unique way. A guiding energy came through she, identifying itself as Maranan. No, I can't pronounce that. Maranan. Bob explained that Maranan usually talked with him while she was venturing out into the non-physical universe. Maranan and Bob had some grand dialogues, but she never gave details of her own personal exploration when she returned to her body. During one session, she got so far out that Maranan became concerned and had to excuse himself to go after her. Bob waited for 15 minutes with real concern to learn what was happening. When Maranan returned, he said that she was enjoying her new freedom so much that she was debating about whether to come back into the physical realm. He told her that she had to come back, since that was part of her contract with her physical world. She soon returned to her physical body, much to Bob's relief. I asked Bob about the guiding forces and whether they were common to his explorers. He explained that everyone who traveled to levels outside the physical realm ran into some type of guiding force. One explorer might interpret the guiding force as a presence. Another might be guided by a voice. Still another explorer might see an energy form similar to or different from the ones I saw. A guiding force might appear first in a robe and later as pure light, explaining that the robe was only necessary because the explorer expected some type of physical form. Titles or names did not seem to be important, since these guiding energies operated in their own ways without regard to how they were interpreted or what they were called. An explorer might refer to the energy form as an angel, Jesus, a guardian, an inner self-helper, a guide, a higher self, a control, a universal consciousness, an invisible helper, a superego, or a guiding voice. It really didn't matter. What we named them from our physical perspective seems to have nothing to do with the nature of the guidance. Bob, this brings up an important question, I asked. If a person doesn't know about or even believe in guidance, is it still possible for the guiding force to get through to them? Absolutely, Bob said with a chuckle. Knowing about or believing in out-of-body travel doesn't determine whether a person goes out-of-body or not. I had never heard of out-of-body travel when I first started having my experiences. I didn't have to believe in the experience to have them. I just had them, and I truly thought I was losing my mind. Let me tell you about a scientist friend of mine whom I talked into having a session in the lab once. He continued with animation. My friend was willing to be hooked up to the lab because I used a technical and scientific approach. Even though he started out as a reluctant subject, he really got into the session. Now here was a man who believed in nothing beyond the physical realm. But during his session he described himself as being guided into a dimension quite foreign to the one with which he was familiar. He encountered beings of a different